The land was dry. The rivers had shrunk to trickles. The fields were cracked and barren. The famine had tightened its grip on the land of Israel, a judgment from the Lord upon a people who had turned to false gods. In the midst of this desolation, a man walked alone. His name was Elijah, a prophet of the Most High God. He had spoken the word of the Lord to King Ahab, declaring that no rain would fall, no dew would touch the earth until God himself commanded it. And so, the skies remained closed. Elijah had been in hiding, sustained by ravens at the brook of Cherith. But now, even that brook had dried up. And then, the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Zarephath, a foreign land, a place outside of Israel, home to those who did not know the God of Abraham. Yet Elijah did not hesitate. He obeyed. After a long journey, he reached the entrance of the city. The sun blazed in the sky, and the air was thick with dust. Then he saw her, a widow, gathering sticks. Elijah approached her and called out, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar, so I may drink?" She paused, looking at the stranger. Water was scarce, but she nodded and turned to fetch it. But as she walked away, Elijah called again, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." At this, she froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, her voice heavy with sorrow. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her words were filled with despair. She had already accepted death. This meal would be their last. But Elijah did not waver. Instead, he spoke again, his voice firm, yet filled with reassurance. "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son." He stepped closer, looking into her eyes. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." A choice lay before her: fear or faith. To cling to what little she had, or trust the word of this prophet and the God of Israel. She swallowed hard, and then she obeyed. She took the last of her flour, the last drops of oil, and made the bread. First, she served Elijah. Then, she turned to her son, breaking the bread and giving him some to eat. And when she looked at her jars, her breath caught. The flour was still there. The oil had not run out. Each day they ate. Each day, the jars remained full. The miracle of God sustained them, just as he had promised. But then, tragedy struck. Her son, her only child, grew ill. His breaths became weak. His small body burned with fever. And then he stopped breathing. A wail of agony filled the house. She turned to Elijah, eyes wild with grief, her voice shaking with accusation. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah's heart ached at her words. He took the boy from her arms, carried him upstairs to the room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die? Let this boy's life return to him." He stretched himself over the child 3 times and pleaded, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The room was silent. Then, suddenly, air rushed into the boy's lungs. His chest rose. His eyes fluttered open. He was alive. Elijah gathered the child in his arms and carried him back downstairs. He placed him in his mother's arms and said, "Look, your son is alive." The widow gasped, holding her son tightly, tears falling from her eyes. And in that moment, she looked at Elijah and declared, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This story is one of faith, provision, and resurrection. The widow of Zarephath had nothing left. She was preparing to die. But when she placed her trust in God, He provided for her in ways she could never have imagined. And when death tried to steal what was dearest to her, God showed that He is not only the provider, but the giver of life itself. What does this teach us? God's provision comes when we trust Him. Even when we have little, if we give in faith, He will sustain us. Matthew 6 verse 33, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Trials do not mean God has abandoned us. The widow had seen God's miracle, yet she still faced sorrow. But in the end, God's power was revealed even greater. Romans 8 verse 28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." God has power over life and death. He is not just the God who gives daily bread. He is the God who restores what was lost. John 11 verse 25, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die." Maybe you feel like you have nothing left. Maybe you feel like you're at the end of your rope. But remember, God's jars never run empty. His provision never fails. And His power is greater than any hardship. Hold on to faith, because with God, even in the darkest times, there is always hope.